Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my top 40 wide receiver rankings for Week 1 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Now, over the course of today's episode, I'm going to be introducing these wide receivers on an individual basis, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions, while also presenting statistics in order to justify their rankings as we approach Week 1. Yes, we're one day closer to the kickoff of the 2024 fantasy football season, and I'm sure we're all excited. Now, a couple reminders before we get into today's content. For those of you who are looking for my thoughts on a specific player, like always, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, of course, be sure to subscribe. We're making daily content for the entirety of the season in order to help you capture a 2024 fantasy football championship. And additionally, for those of you guys who still haven't drafted and are waiting up until the final minute to do so, if you guys are still interested, you can go ahead, head on over to Underdog Fantasy, signing up today using code Andrew and making a first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only claims you the first-time deposit offer, but you'll get my 2024 fantasy football draft guide and rankings. Additionally, you'll get rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season, all positions, including flex, half PPR, full PPR. Even if you've already drafted, this is something that you may be interested in. And you can take advantage, of course, of the free pick going into Thursday night's game of Travis Kelce, 0.5 total yards, which again can start off your 2024 season the right way. So if you're interested, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen in order to determine your eligibility based on your location. If you are not eligible because of your location or you've used a code in the past, you can also go ahead and check out Patreon. All that information and link down in the description, all this content and much more available there. Thank you very much for all the support. Okay, so let's get into talking about my Week 1 wide receiver rankings, beginning with Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill, again, last season, was on pace to potentially breaking the record for most receiving yards by a wide receiver in a single season. And like many of us have witnessed over the last couple seasons, it is a very difficult record to break. But yet, despite the fact that he wasn't able to break that record, he was breaking a bunch of other records while being able to average 19.5 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, scoring from between weeks 1 through 19. Yes, I included the NFL playoff game against the Chiefs because, again, I want to represent just how good Tyreek Hill was for the entirety of the 2023 year, and that's only going to continue going into Week 1. The thing about Tyreek Hill, he's unlike any other player. In any given week, he could either put up 15 points or 45 points. Really, that is his capabilities. Over the course of the last couple seasons, the first month of the year, especially as a Dolphin, I mean, there have been 40-point, 35-point performances, 29-point performances, incredible games that he has put forth, and hopefully we can find that in Week 1 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Based on Vegas total points, 49.5, it's the second highest implicated game in terms of total scoring. Hopefully it's a shootout against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Number 2, we have CeeDee Lamb. Of course, CeeDee Lamb has a difficult matchup on his hand, taking on the Cleveland Browns. Again, amongst all teams in 2023, the Cleveland Browns secondary allowed the third fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which again doesn't bode well for CeeDee Lamb. But what does bode well for CeeDee Lamb is the fact that they move him around this formation a lot. I mean, he played a lot within the slot position last season amongst all wide receivers, led in every single statistical category in regards to the slot receiving role: targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. So even with guys like Denzel Ward on the outside, they're not going to follow him into the slot position. The expectation is that he's going to be able to find himself a lot of opportunity in a potential negative game script. They are minus 2.5 point underdogs going into the week. And from what we saw last season, averaging 11 targets per game, 19.5 fantasy points per game, the expectation should be a big week here for CeeDee Lamb. Number 3, we have Amon-Ra St. taking on the Los Angeles Rams. He had an opportunity of taking on the Rams last year in the playoffs. In that game, 7 receptions, 110 receiving yards, 14.5 fantasy points and a half PPR scoring format. And this was all while he only had 1 target and 1 reception in the fourth quarter. And I can guarantee you going into this week's game, that is probably not going to ever happen again. When you have a dominant wide receiver threat of the capacity of Amon-Ra St. giving him 1 target and 1 reception in a second half in which your offense barely is able to score, is the reason why you weren't able to score. So they're going to continue to look in his direction as they typically do, 10 plus times per game. He's going to get his opportunity, and based on Vegas total points, 51, this is implicated to be the highest scoring game of the weekend. The Sunday Night Football game taking on the Los Angeles Rams should be an exciting one, and of course, Amon-Ra should deliver another great performance for us. Number 4, we have Justin Jefferson. I know that many of you are still worried about Sam Darnold, but just to put this into perspective, I mentioned this during my top 32 quarterback rankings video for the preseason draft rankings. When I looked at the last 16 games of Sam Darnold's career, he has been able to score a total of 25 total touchdowns in those last 16 starts. So just putting into perspective, Sam Darnold is a lot better than maybe people give him credit for. Obviously, when you think of Sam Darnold, you think of his days with the New York Jets, but recently as a member of the Carolina Panthers, or even as a San Francisco 49er, he has learned, he has developed as a quarterback, and honestly, he has earned the starting job of this team. So going forward, we do anticipate Justin Jefferson to find success. He takes on the New York Giants. Specifically, the advantageous point of this matchup is the top two cornerbacks of this defense. Jackson and Banks, both of them ranked within the top 20 in terms of receiving yards allowed to opposing wide receivers. So we are anticipating a lot of success for Justin Jefferson. The last time he took on this defense, in 2022, 7 catches for 47 in the playoffs, and during the regular season, 12 catches for 133 and a touchdown. Those are the kind of performances we're hoping for in week 1. Number 5, to begin the A tier, we have Ja'Marr Chase. Now, Ja'Marr Chase, again, still at this current moment in time, as I am recording, has not signed a contract. The expectation is that hopefully that will happen in the coming days. But considering he hasn't been able to practice with the team, hasn't been at training camp, he may not be at a full capacity, even if in fact he signs a contract and plays this upcoming weekend against the New England Patriots. And considering the fact that the Cincinnati Bengals are 8.5-point favorites going into the game already, the expectation is that if we're going to see a lesser version of Ja'Marr Chase because he doesn't play as much, and the Cincinnati Bengals are going to be leading in the second half and running the ball out, the expectation is maybe a lesser week from Ja'Marr Chase. That is why I have him in number 5. But he is Ja'Marr Chase. You spent a first-round selection for him. Therefore, if he's playing, he's in your lineup. Moving on to our number 6, we have Puka Nacua, the thumbnail of today's episode. In the playoffs against the Detroit Lions last year, had 9 receptions for 181 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown for 28.4 half PPR fantasy points. In 5 of the last 7 games that Puka Nacua has played, he's been able to exceed over 90 total yards. He's finding himself a lot of success, and that is only going to continue the momentum going into the 2024 year. Taking on the Detroit Lions is an advantageous matchup, and we'll talk about this in regards to Cooper Kupp in just a moment, but both these guys should have themselves incredible games, primarily because the Detroit Lions defense last season gave up the 3rd most points to opposing wide receivers on a weekly basis in terms of receiving statistics isolated. Sure, they have made some potential changes to improve this secondary, but the fact of the matter is it is not enough to stop a guy like Puka Nacua, and based on the implicated total via Vegas, this should be the highest scoring game of the week, and hopefully Puka finds himself in the end zone. Number 7, we have A.J. Brown, who takes on the Green Bay Packers in Brazil. We're hoping that, considering this is the first Brazil game, that there's going to be an incredible shootout between these two teams. The last time these two teams played, if I'm not mistaken, back in 2022, it was like 33-40. So if in fact we could potentially get a game of that kind of caliber, the talent of A.J. Brown should be able to find himself a lot of success, especially considering he is the de facto number 1 of the Philadelphia Eagles offense. I mean, when you're best friends with the quarterback, you earn yourself the privilege of getting yourself potentially 9 to 10 targets per game on average. Yes, he's a deep receiving threat, but I'm hoping there is a potential in which they can give him more opportunity within the red zone. And if the new offensive coordinator, Kellen Moore, can elevate the play of Jalen Hurts threw 15 picks last year and had 15 rushing touchdowns. If we can lower both those numbers, it is only going to help the potential upside of A.J. Brown. Number 8, we have Mike Evans. Mike Evans is he's consistent. And going into this week, he has such an advantageous matchup, it is difficult to ignore. When we talk about the consistency of Mike Evans, I'm referring to stats like this. Last season, he played 18 healthy games, including the NFL playoffs. In those 18 games, 12 of them consisted of a touchdown minimum. So about 67% of the time, he is scoring a touchdown within these games. Some of these games scoring multiple touchdowns. Now he has an opportunity of taking on the Washington Commanders, whose secondary is still a liability. They give up the most points to opposing wide receivers last season, 35.54 on a weekly basis, which was about 190 receiving yards, 1.7 touchdowns per game, 14 receptions per game to opposing wide receivers. There's enough statistics for both Mike Evans and Chris Godwin to have themselves great overall weeks. I also wanted to go ahead and include the fact that the primary 2 cornerbacks for the Washington Commanders, Benjamin St-Juste and Michael Davis, both of them are top 6 in terms of receiving yards allowed to opposing wide receivers last season. Should be a field day for Mike Evans. Number 9, we have Garrett Wilson. Again, Garrett Wilson is the primary number 1 of this offense. And even though they do take on a great defense in the San Francisco 49ers, regardless of which cornerback he lines up against, it is going to be a difficult matchup. But the fact of the matter is, you can line him up out wide, in the slot, and he's going to get targets regardless of that fact. I mean, Aaron Rodgers is going to funnel him the ball. I mean, we talked about this a lot this offseason. Garrett Wilson is pretty much going to be the Davante Adams of this offense. This is the best wide receiver that Aaron Rodgers has played with since he has departed with Davante Adams back in 2021. In that season, I mean, again, getting himself 10 targets per game plus, over 20 fantasy points per game plus. So hopefully that transitions in the direction of Garrett Wilson, who is certainly talented enough to be able to take the opportunity given by Aaron Rodgers and deliver. Now, when we look at the overall underdog pick'ems this week, I've been rolling through them every single day, just trying to find the best overall plays. Via Garrett Wilson, his number is 6 receptions, which in my opinion, I think is a little too low, especially in a game in which they are considered to be the underdogs and they probably will have a negative game script. Over the course of the last, 16 games that Aaron Rodgers played with Davante Adams, only twice did he have less than 6 receptions. So my anticipation is a pretty solid week, a lot of opportunity, and hopefully him finding the end zone. Number 10, we have Nico Collins. Nico Collins, when we talk about the matchup against the Indianapolis Colts, besides the fact that Vegas has that as the third highest scoring potential game in week 1, Nico Collins in the last 2 games against the Indianapolis Colts has put up 30 fantasy points and 24 fantasy points. In these games, 9 catches, 195 and a touchdown, 7 catches, 146 in a touchdown. Incredible numbers across the board. And we're hoping that going into this week, we're only going to continue that momentum in which Nico Collins and CJ Stroud are dominating against this defense. Obviously, in these games, big plays over the top of the opposing defense. But last season, I can clearly remember, I've said this on multiple occasions in, last season's videos, the Indianapolis Colts secondary was giving up a lot of big plays. And that's only going to continue with all of the weapons that are in this Houston Texans offense. The expectation is that Nico Collins, Stefon Diggs, Tank Dell, any of them can make a play over the top of that defense. So again, there is a lot of target competition, but considering the success and the fact that he is still the number 1, I'm expecting Nico Collins to maintain as a wide receiver 1 going into week 1. Number 11, we have Cooper Kupp. Like I mentioned just moments ago in regards to Puka Nacua, this is a very advantageous matchup. Last season, the Detroit Lions were allowing the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers in regards to receiving statistics isolated. Considering the fact that this is expected to be the highest scoring matchup of week 1, and the fact that Cooper Kupp, again, is going to be fully healthy and has a full offseason of training rather than rehabilitation for his injuries, we're anticipating that Cooper Kupp should immediately make an impact. The last time he took on the Detroit Lions wasn't as incredible of a game. Unfortunately, only had himself 5 receptions on 9 targets for 27 receiving yards. Again, only 5.2 fantasy points and a half PPR. But when Cooper Kupp was healthy last season, he was averaging 9 targets per game. He's going to get himself the opportunity, and considering the fact that the secondary isn't great, should find himself a lot of success. Number 12, we have Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel's taking on the New York Jets. It is the most difficult matchup by far. In fact, the New York Jets last season only allowed 5 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers in 17 games. Just putting that into perspective, just how great that secondary is and how great they're going to potentially play going into the given week. But what makes Deebo Samuel different is not only the fact that he's going to be able to have himself a little bit more of an advantage in comparison to Ayuk, considering Ayuk has not been present in training camp, and the game plan may be more Deebo focused in week 1. But the fact that Deebo Samuel last season was averaging 12.16 fantasy points per game just on receiving statistics alone, while averaging 3.87 fantasy points per game based on rushing statistics. He can do it on the ground and through the air. And considering he most likely won't see a lot of Sauce Gardner going into the week, I am anticipating a top 12 performance from Deebo Samuel. Number 13, we have Davante Adams. Again, the whole deal with Davante Adams is if he gets enough opportunity, he is going to deliver for fantasy purposes. Last season, again, with Aiden O'Connell averaging 10.78 targets per game. And great for him, he now gets a quarterback that loves to funnel his number 1 overall target, which again is Gardner Minshew. Last season, in the 11 healthy games that we saw Michael Pittman play with a starting Gardner Minshew, we were able to see Michael Pittman Jr. get himself 10 plus targets in 8 of those 11 healthy games. So if in fact we're going to be in a situation in which Davante Adams, 10 to 11 targets within the given week, should be able to find himself success taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. Last season, in the 2 games in which he took on that secondary, 8 catches for 75, 8 catches for 101 and a touchdown. That's the level of production we anticipate. We're hoping for the upside. We have number 14, Drake London, to begin the C tier, who takes on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Arthur Smith is now the offensive coordinator of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's the former head coach and play caller of the Atlanta Falcons. So this is going to be a little bit of a revenge game for the players who remain within the Falcons, who were obviously drafted by the organization when Arthur Smith was here. Bijan Robinson, Drake London, Kyle Pitts, players that are now here to prove, hey, you used us the wrong way, and now we're going to go ahead and take it out on your new team. And that's hopefully going to be the case, especially considering, of course, Drake London is going to get himself a high volume of targets going forward. This is something that is going to be new for him. Throughout his entire career, very seldom did he have himself a great volume of opportunity. In fact, over the course of the last 2 seasons, whether it was with Mariota, Ritter, Heineke, he's only been given 8 plus targets 12 different times. And in those games, averaging 13.1 fantasy points per game. Kirk Cousins' number 1 wide receivers over the course of the last 6 seasons, 2018 to 2023, have been averaging 9.1 targets per game. The opportunity is going to be there. And of course, we still have experience with Zach Robinson. He obviously was a passing game coordinator of the Rams last year. They did take on the Pittsburgh Steelers. In that game, Puka Nacua, 8 catches for 154. An incredible overall performance. So hopefully, Zach Robinson is going to be able to look at the film of that game and seamlessly transition it into this overall offense in order to dominate that Pittsburgh secondary. Number 15, we have Jaylen Waddle. We did get exciting news regarding Jaylen Waddle and the fact that he's practicing and should be a full go this upcoming Sunday against the Jacksonville Jaguars. That is the expectation. As of this current moment in time, it is implicated to be the second highest scoring game of the week, 49.5 points. So if in fact we're going to get a shootout between Tua and Trevor Lawrence, there's going to be a lot of potential for Jaylen Waddle at a full healthy rate to find success, because in the last 2 years, when he has been fully healthy, he's averaging 13.87 fantasy points per game with Tua Tagovailoa under center. And I understand that there is a potential in which, again, he is still returning from an injury. They might want to utilize him at a lower potential rate, considering they want to keep him protected. It is a very long season ahead. So as long as there are no setbacks over the course of this week, I'm firing him up. I have him as my number 15 wide receiver. I'm excited about the potential of this matchup being a shootout. Number 16, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. You know, for a wide receiver that was selected 4th overall to the Arizona Cardinals, he is now given one of the more difficult tests to begin his NFL career. Has to take on the Buffalo Bills secondary, which again is not fun. They are one of the toughest matchups at the position. In fact, last season, throughout all of their games, they only allowed 70 or more receiving yards to 7 different wide receivers total. Again, not a lot of success was found against this Buffalo Bills secondary, primarily because of how well their cornerbacks have played. So the expectation is that, of course, this is going to be a difficult matchup. And this is probably going to be a negative game script for the Arizona Cardinals. But this should lead to a lot of targets in the direction of Marvin Harrison Jr. and Trey McBride. And hopefully, Marvin Harrison will be given enough opportunity to prove why he was a top 4 pick in the NFL draft. Last season, when Kyler returned from weeks 10 through 18, the Arizona Cardinals were throwing the ball about 33.5 times per game. I'm anticipating that number to jump, considering the negative game script, and of course, lead to a lot of opportunity for Marvin Harrison Jr. Number 17, we have Chris Olave taking on the Carolina Panthers. Last season against the Carolina Panthers in week 2, 11 targets, 6 catches, 86 yards for 11.6 fantasy points. Solid week, good opportunity. Then in week 14, 5 targets, 4 catches, 28 yards and a touchdown. Saved this week with that overall touchdown, but 10 plus fantasy points in both these overall contests. Now we get a new offensive coordinator that really can utilize Chris Olave at his highest potential peak and give him opportunities to make plays after the catch and get him opportunities to get wide open, so that regardless of how inaccurate a lot of Derek Carr's overall passes are, he's going to be in a situation to find himself a lot of success. Again, he is the de facto number 1 of this offense. I know that the matchup against the Carolina Panthers have typically been a lower scoring game, but I'm hoping that the Carolina Panthers offense has improved enough to where this could be a back and forth matchup in which both teams are scoring and being forced to pass the ball on a consistent rate to get Chris Olave the opportunity he needs to get all those yards after the catch. Number 18, we have DJ Moore. DJ Moore has himself a pretty difficult matchup in my mind. I mean, again, they take on the Tennessee Titans. They have completely revamped their defense and their secondary, primarily with L'Jarius Sneed being their primary number 1 coverage corner. Obviously, they traded for him this offseason from the Kansas City Chiefs. L'Jarius Sneed was great last year and is only going to continue. And the new defensive coordinator of the Tennessee Titans is a former defensive backs coach for the Baltimore Ravens. Again, the expectation is that a lot of the focus is going to be behind stopping DJ Moore for this defense. Considering, again, DJ Moore was able to have himself a lot of success last year, regardless of the quarterback play. But with Justin Fields, if you're able to average 16 fantasy points per game, we're going to hope that it is only going to get easier with Caleb Williams going into this given week. We're hoping for a lot of opportunity for DJ Moore, but I just wanted to go ahead and represent just how difficult the matchup could potentially be with L'Jarius Sneed as the primary coverage. Number 19, we have DK Metcalf. Speaking of facing difficult primary coverage, DK Metcalf has his hands full this week with Patrick Surtain II. Last year, DK Metcalf, again, had himself an okay year, but we're hoping for more. We're hoping that Brian Grubb can come into this offense and elevate him even beyond that and get him into the top 12 conversation on a consistent basis. And the primary way to get him there is within the deep receiving game and finding himself in the end zone often. I mean, look, last season, he had himself a 55.46% catch rate. Anytime DK Metcalf last year, or even in 2022, was able to get himself 5 or more receptions, he was averaging 15.1 fantasy points per game. If you can make him not only just a deep receiver, but a possession receiver, a guy that can make plays after the catch. Again, he's one of the fastest in the National Football League amongst all players in the league last year. According to Next Gen Stats, he was the fastest player on a single play in the 2023 year. Just get him the ball in his hands and let him make plays after the catch on a consistent basis. All right, moving on to our number 20, we have Michael Pittman Jr. taking on his division rival in the Houston Texans. Again, like I mentioned earlier in regards to Nico Collins, this is expected to be the 3rd highest scoring game of week 1, which again, if this is going to be a back and forth matchup, which we're hoping, it could lead to Michael Pittman Jr. finding himself a lot of success. And considering the offense is going to have a healthy Jonathan Taylor and Anthony Richardson, we are anticipating more potential scoring from the Indianapolis Colts in comparison to what they were putting forth last year with Gardner Minshew. But as long as the targets are going in the direction of Michael Pittman Jr., which it should, he should find himself a lot of success. Now, even though last year in the matchups against Houston, he didn't find an abundance of success, 8 catches for 56, 5 catches for 44, we are expecting the elevation of this offense to continue to bleed into the upside of Michael Pittman Jr. Number 21, we have T. Higgins. Now, if in fact we are in a situation in which Ja'Marr Chase does not sign a contract going into Sunday's game, I do want to go ahead and put this into perspective. From 2022 to 2023, in games in which T. Higgins has played without Ja'Marr Chase in the lineup, T. Higgins is averaging 8.8 targets, 6.2 receptions, 102.2 receiving yards, 0.6 receiving touchdowns, and 16.92 fantasy points per game. If Ja'Marr Chase is not ready for week 1 and is not signed and is not playing, T. Higgins is going to be a top 5 wide receiver in my book going into the given week. The fact that the Cincinnati Bengals are 8.5 point favorites going into the matchup, and the fact that just most recently back in 2022, the Cincinnati Bengals took on the New England Patriots. T. Higgins in that game, 8 catches for 128 and a touchdown, a total of 22.8 fantasy points and a half PPR. The expectation would be an abundance of success in the absence of Ja'Marr Chase. We're hoping Chase is going to be ready and signed and ready to go. But if in fact he is not, T. Higgins' overall ranking jumps a pretty big margin. Number 22. To begin the next tier, we have Chris Godwin, who takes on the Washington Commanders. Like I mentioned just moments ago with Mike Evans, this is a very advantageous matchup. The Washington Commanders allowed the most points to opposing wide receivers last season, 35.54 on a per-game average in a half PPR scoring format. Points gathered from just receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. Now that you have Chris Godwin going back to the slot position, and you have Liam Cohen as the offensive coordinator, a former offensive coordinator of the Los Angeles Rams. He knows how to utilize Cooper Kupp in that kind of slot receiving role. He should be able to give opportunities to Chris Godwin within that very similar role. And considering the fact that this secondary, they've tried to make improvements, but quite frankly, they are still a liability. I mentioned it earlier with Mike Evans, the number 1 and number 2 cornerbacks. The starting cornerbacks of the Washington Commanders were both in the top 6 in terms of yards allowed to opposing wide receivers last year. Chris Godwin should also have himself a great week here. Number 23, we have Rashee Rice. Rashee Rice last season took on the Baltimore Ravens in the NFL playoffs. In that game, had himself great level of opportunity, 8 receptions, but only 46 receiving yards, primarily because of his average depth of target. So I went ahead and did a little bit of research. In the last 4 games that Rashee Rice played in the 2023 season, this is being in the NFL playoffs, his average depth of target, 1.8, 5.1, 1.3, and 6.7. So obviously he's going to get himself a lot of receptions. In a full PPR scoring format, maybe even more valuable going into the given week in the absence of Marquise Hollywood Brown, which creates more target opportunity for someone like Rashee Rice, who has already built himself a rapport with Patrick Mahomes in year 1, while Xavier Worthy's still going to have to build that rapport going over the course of this season. So the expectation is that Rashee Rice should find himself a lot of opportunity. Among all players last season, this is a stat that I found yesterday, in fact, he was number 2 in terms of open separation rate, only behind Zay Flowers and ahead of Tyreek Hill. If you're going to find him open as often as he is, last season from weeks 12 through 22, averaging 9 targets per game, should have himself a lot of opportunity to go ahead and get those receptions, but get the yardage, potentially a lot of yards after the catch, and hopefully find himself in the end zone. Last year, led all Chiefs in terms of red zone targets. Number 24, we have DeVonta Smith. Like I mentioned earlier with A.J. Brown, the new offensive coordinator should hopefully elevate the potential of Jalen Hurts, which should then elevate DeVonta Smith as he is going to be the primary slot receiver. And like we have heard all offseason, they're moving these wide receivers around a lot. They're using a lot of motion pre-snap, which wasn't something that they utilized last season, which makes it easier for someone like Jalen Hurts to dissect the defense, understand whether it's a man or zone coverage, and be able to attack it accordingly. Now, we've talked about this all offseason. Kellen Moore has elevated guys like CeeDee Lamb and Keenan Allen recently. And a lot of those overall statistics that they gathered were within the slot position. That is the role of DeVonta Smith going into this week. Again, the primary number 1 nickel cornerback, their primary slot corner for the Green Bay Packers, Keyshawn Nixon, was number 2 in terms of total receptions, targets, and yards allowed to opposing wide receivers in the slot last season. We are expecting a pretty solid week here for DeVonta Smith. Number 25, we have Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs, again, in a matchup where it should be a higher scoring game, but the question is he going to be given enough opportunity? I do believe that the number 25 overall ranking is a safe one. Once we have week 1 in the books and we can dissect the overall snap counts, the potential routes ran, the overall utilization, then we can get an understanding as to how they're going to utilize these three receivers. But until then, Stefon Diggs should be in sight for a pretty decent game here. Again, the Indianapolis Colts, like I mentioned earlier, gave up huge monster performances last year to not only Nico Collins, but also Tank Dell. So CJ Stroud has found himself a lot of success within this matchup against the division rival, and Stefon Diggs immediately coming in should be the primary slot receiving threat of this offense. Kenny Moore, amongst all nickel cornerbacks last year, gave up the 6th most receiving yards within the slot position. Should be a fun game here for Stefon Diggs. Number 26, we have Amari Cooper. Amari Cooper has a revenge game against his former team, and usually I like revenge games a lot, but we're still trying to see what exactly we are going to get out of Deshaun Watson. Which Deshaun Watson are we going to have starting week 1? Because last year, Deshaun Watson with Amari Cooper was fantastic. In their games in which they played together, 5 of them in which Deshaun Watson was fully healthy, Amari Cooper averaging 7.8 targets, 5.6 receptions, a total of 96 yards, 0.4 receiving touchdowns, and 14.8 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. And now that he takes on his former team who traded him away for just a 5th round pick, and since then has been dominating in the National Football League, I mean, he is going to see a lot of familiar faces that he took on in training camps of seasons past, and hopefully he'll be ready to be able to exploit those matchups that he did back in training camps. Moving on to our number 27, we have Zay Flowers. I have a lot of confidence in Zay Flowers. I mean, the last time we saw him against the Kansas City Chiefs, he had himself an incredible game, 8 targets, 5 receptions, 115 yards, and a receiving touchdown. 2 rushing attempts for 4 rushing yards, 18.4 fantasy points. And you may think, wow, Andrew, that's a great performance. But for those of you who watched that AFC Championship game, Zay Flowers quite literally fumbled on the 1-inch yard line and could have scored a 2nd touchdown in that game. But he fumbled and it was a touchback. So he could have very easily had himself over 25 fantasy points, but unfortunately was not the case. They're going to give him opportunity. Zay Flowers should be a main focus of this offensive attack. Yes, so they're going to have more utilization in the direction of Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, which wasn't present in that game against the Kansas City Chiefs. But the fact of the matter is, regardless of the matchup, Zay Flowers amongst all wide receivers last season was number 1 in terms of open separation rate. Should find himself oftentimes open with a step potential advantage against the defenders covering him, and should be able to find himself a lot of opportunity in this matchup. Number 28, we have Malik Nabers. Malik Nabers, again, is going to be at the mercy of what Daniel Jones we witnessed this week. And to begin his first test of his NFL career, he's lining up against Stephon Gilmore, which again is a very difficult matchup. A former Defensive Player of the Year in the National Football League, a Super Bowl champion, one of the best cornerbacks that we have seen over the course of the last decade. But luckily for Malik Nabers, Daniel Jones typically has himself his best games against the Minnesota Vikings. Going back to 2022, in both games in which the New York Giants took on the Minnesota Vikings, both times Daniel Jones was able to surpass over 300 passing yards. So hopefully it is going to elevate the potential of Malik Nabers. We do know that Brian Daboll, the current head coach and offensive play caller of the New York Giants, he is very familiar with Brian Flores' defenses, who is the current defensive coordinator of the Minnesota Vikings. Back in their days in which, of course, Brian Daboll was the offensive coordinator of the Buffalo Bills, and Brian Flores was the head coach of the Miami Dolphins. There were a lot of games there where the Buffalo Bills offense was destroying that Miami defense. So Brian Daboll should be scheming up a lot of opportunities for Malik Nabers to have himself immediate success in week 1. Number 29, we have Tank Dell. Again, an advantageous matchup, expected to be a shootout, the 3rd potential highest scoring game of the week based on Vegas implications. If in fact Tank Dell can put up another performance like he did in week 2 against the Indianapolis Colts, 7 catches, 72 receiving yards, a receiving touchdown, all of that totaling for 16.7 fantasy points. Again, it wouldn't surprise us. He may be the number 3 receiving option of this offense, but even with that being the case, should still be given enough opportunity, and there will be plays drawn up specifically to get him open. Could find himself in the end zone, and none of us would be surprised. Quite frankly, if you drafted him, you believe enough to where you're probably starting him going into this week. Number 30, we have Terry McLaurin, the primary number 1 de facto wide receiver of the Washington Commanders. Now that Jahan Dotson has been traded away, it continues to solidify the fact that Terry McLaurin is going to get himself a lot of opportunity. And if in fact this is going to lead to a negative game script against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who again have themselves a great offense, going up against a mediocre defense but a below average overall secondary, the expectation should be a negative game script in which, of course, Jaden Daniels should be throwing the ball a lot in that second half. And hopefully he's going to be looking in the direction of Terry McLaurin, his number 1 option. But considering he is a rookie quarterback, a lot of these targets could go towards a tight end, could go towards a running back like Eckler, if those happen to be his safety blanket. We're just hoping that McLaurin is going to get enough targets, considering they most likely will be trailing for most of this contest. Number 31, we have Brandon Ayuk. The reason why I have Brandon Ayuk at number 31 is first and foremost the matchup. It is the most difficult matchup at the position. He will be seeing a lot of Sauce Gardner potentially. They allowed the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers last season. 16.24 fantasy points per game. which again doesn't bode well for Brandon Ayuk, especially considering he has not had a training camp, and he most likely won't be the offensive focus going into week 1's overall matchup. So if he's going to get himself somewhere between 4 to 6 targets, we have to hope that it's going to be implicated with a touchdown. And like I mentioned earlier with Deebo Samuel, the New York Jets defense only allowed 5 receiving touchdowns to opposing wide receivers last season in 17 games. So again, it is a difficult matchup. He hasn't had training camp. He may not be in full game shape. And the reason why, again, he is here and someone like Ja'Marr Chase is at number 5, even with Ja'Marr Chase potentially signing and playing on Sunday, is the fact that you drafted Ja'Marr Chase in your first round. Brandon Ayuk, for many of us, is a discount player, and we can't afford to put him on our bench if, in fact, we have significantly better options going into the week, which, again, you'd have to play in a smaller league to be able to have that luxury. Number 32, we have George Pickens. George Pickens, again, in his career, when given ample opportunity, has been awesome. I mean, last season, 4+ receptions, averaging 14.39 fantasy points per game. And last season, Russell Wilson, as a member of the Denver Broncos, who is now the starting quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers, a huge elevation there, was able to help elevate guys like Courtland Sutton to being a top 36 wide receiver on 11 different weeks. So George Pickens should be a consistent top 36 wide receiver, especially when we consider last season Russell Wilson was able to elevate Courtland Sutton to scoring double-digit touchdowns. If that can happen for George Pickens, it's going to be fantastic. There isn't really much target competition outside of Freiermuth and Warren, but this offense will not be throwing the ball a lot. They want to protect the ball. They want to run the ball. And that is what Arthur Smith has done over the years as the offensive play caller of the Atlanta Falcons. And this upcoming week, it is a little bit of a revenge game in which Arthur Smith wants to prove to his former organization that, hey, listen, I know how to call plays. You guys just didn't set me up for success. We'll see how that turns out. Number 33, we have Calvin Ridley. The Chicago Bears have a really elite run-stopping defense. And I mentioned this earlier. And considering that fact, we are most likely going to see a very Brian Callahan-led offense in terms of a lot of throwing. Again, he is a former offensive coordinator of the Bengals, and he has said on multiple occasions this offseason, I want to utilize Calvin Ridley as my Ja'Marr Chase. And if that's going to be the case, we should see a lot of opportunity going towards Calvin Ridley. But we are hearing a little bit of traction and rumors that there is a potential which DeAndre Hopkins does in fact play in week 1. DeAndre Hopkins, over the course of the last 5-6 years that I've been doing this, has always played injured. He is just a tough son of a gun, is always going to play regardless of injury. So expect to see DeAndre Hopkins out there. Expect to see less potential upside in terms of targets for Calvin Ridley as they'll spread the ball out a little bit more. But hopefully, he still is able to find himself a lot of success despite the fact that Chicago's secondary is also really good. Number 34. Speaking of Chicago, we have the number 2 receiving option of the Chicago Bears, as I anticipate to see it, Keenan Allen. He takes on the Tennessee Titans, and the expectation going into the matchup is that in the beginning of the season, we may not immediately see Rome Odunze be a primary receiving target of the offense, and the veteran status of Keenan Allen may garner him far more targets within the beginning of the year. Taking on the Tennessee Titans, like I mentioned with DJ Moore, it is a significantly improved overall secondary, especially in terms of their outside corner coverage. Within the slot position, Keenan Allen can take on anyone and find success. That is how talented he is. As long as he is given opportunity, that's all that matters, and we're anticipating for him to get that opportunity in week 1. Number 35, Christian Kirk. Speaking of opportunity, again, we don't know whether or not this offense is going to look similar to what it did this time last year, week 1, in which week 1 of the 2023 season, the Jacksonville Jaguars utilized a lot of 12 personnel. And once, in fact, Zay Jones went down with injury, we saw a lot more Christian Kirk. But if, in fact, we're going to be in a situation where they're going to use a lot of 12 personnel, run the ball more, have a lot of 2 tight end sets, considering, of course, how much Doug Peterson loves to utilize his tight ends, if we're going to be in that kind of a situation, going up against the Miami Dolphins, it could be tough. But they are playing the Dolphins. The Dolphins are going to score, and it is going to put, of course, the pressure on the Jacksonville Jaguars to have to compete and keep up with them. In a potential negative game script, I anticipate to see a lot of 3 wide receiver sets and a lot of opportunity going in the direction of Christian Kirk, the primary slot receiving option of this offense that over the course of the last 2 years has averaged 11 to 12 fantasy points per game. 36, we have Diontae Johnson. Now, even though Diontae Johnson hasn't had a recent experience against the Saints to give us a little bit of an understanding as to what we could potentially expect to see, Dave Canales, the current head coach and primary play caller of this team, is a former offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, faced this defense twice last year. In those games, Chris Godwin, as an outside receiver, dominating. I mean, again, in those games, 8 catches for 114, 15.4 fantasy points, 3 catches for 81 and a touchdown, 15.6. And as we know, Mike Evans typically disappears in games against the New Orleans Saints. He has a storied history of struggling against the Saints, but we did see Chris Godwin step up in the matchup while playing on the outside 70% of the time. Diontae Johnson, as the primary number one receiver of this offense, should find himself a lot of success, and hopefully we will immediately see the elevation of Bryce Young considering the presence of Dave Canales. Number 37, we have Josh Palmer. Josh Palmer, again, should be the number one of this offense, and it may take a little bit of time for Ladd McConkey to get there, but in the meanwhile, Josh Palmer should be the number one from weeks 3 through 18 of last year, averaging 10.5 fantasy points per game on 7 targets per game. Now, when we look at the last 2 matchups against the Raiders, again, Josh Palmer has been great. 3 catches for 77, over 10 fantasy points. And then in week 15, even without, Justin Herbert in the lineup, 4 catches for 113 and a touchdown, 21.3 fantasy points. So there is some potential here in which, of course, Josh Palmer is going to get himself the primary receiving opportunity as the number one receiving option of this offense. Now, speaking of number one receiving options, we don't know exactly who the number one is going to be for the Green Bay Packers. It could be Jayden Reed, it could be Romeo Doubs, it could be Christian Watson, it could be Dontavion Wicks, and no one would be surprised. The fact of the matter is, there is a lot of rotation at the top of this overall conversation, and Jordan Love is just going to find the open receiving targets. Jayden Reed most recently has been the favorite target from weeks 10 through 18, 7 targets per game, 15 fantasy points per game, scoring 7 touchdowns in those last 8 games. And considering the Philadelphia Eagles gave up the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, 35.44 on a per game average. Sure, they have tried to make improvements in their secondary. They have brought in a new defensive coordinator in Vic Fangio. All of these potential changes in order to help improve that defense. If in fact this is going to be a shootout and both teams are going to find themselves a lot of success offensively, it's not going to matter. Number 39, we have Courtland Sutton. Again, another one of these options that even though he is on a lesser offense and they're expected to be the second biggest underdogs going into week 1, I believe they are 6-point underdogs. The expectation is a negative game script. And if in fact that is going to be the case, he's the number one target and he's competing with Marvin Mims, Josh Reynolds, and Greg Dulcich. The fact of the matter is Courtland Sutton should see himself a healthy volume of targets, and with opportunity will come success. The fact of the matter is, in the last 16 healthy games Courtland Sutton has played, he has scored 11 touchdowns. So hopefully, Bo Nix can elevate him to that level. The final player I wanted to mention today is Jaxon Smith-Njigba, who by the time we get to Sunday may be a lesser potential option if in fact we get a full designation that Tyler Lockett is going to play. The expectation is that Tyler Lockett is going to practice this week. If there are no setbacks, that he will play, and it could lower the potential upside of Jaxon Smith-Njigba. But as of this current moment in time, the Seattle Seahawks are 6-point favorites against Courtland Sutton and the Denver Broncos. We are hoping that Jaxon Smith-Njigba, in the absence of Tyler Lockett from practice over the course of the last couple weeks of training camp, has established himself as the number 2 receiving option and can continue that going into the given week with a high volume of opportunity and able to prove to everybody why he was a first-round pick in 2023. All right, everybody, thank you for watching. These are my top 40 wide receivers for week 1 of the 2024 fantasy football season. I'll be back tomorrow with top 16 quarterback and tight end rankings. Until then, be sure to subscribe, click the like button down below. Again, if you guys want my full extensive rankings, you can either check out Underdog Fantasy using code Andrew and make a first-time deposit minimum of $10, or you can check out Patreon. All of that content available there and much more. All that information down in the description. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.